The silence on the Dakota prairie wasn't empty. It was a predator. For 2 years, it had stalked Abigail Hale, ever since the fever stole her husband, Walter, and left her alone in the cabin he'd built with his own hands. The silence ate at her memories, sat in Walter's empty chair, and stared back at her from the vast, unending sky. It was a cold, heavy thing, made of wind and grief, and it had hollowed her out until all that was left was a woman who just was. Her life was a quiet loop of chores, tending the garden, mending shirts for a man who would never wear them again. Her world had shrunk to this tiny island in a sea of grass. She was a ghost, haunted by the life she used to have. Her only living connection was a half-mile down the creek. A Lakota woman named Winona and her son, Chaitan. They were ghosts of a different kind, living on the edge of a world that wanted them gone. They didn't talk much. They traded goods, preserves for herbs, a mended blanket for deerskin. It was a silent language of respect between two lonely women. In Winona's eyes, Abigail didn't see pity. She saw a woman who also knew the crushing weight of silence. But one afternoon, as the sun bled across the horizon, a new sound came. A wrong sound. Not the wind, not a hawk. It was the jangle of metal and the low, cruel laughter of men. 5 of them. Dark shapes against the dying light. They weren't cowboys. They moved like wolves, their eyes scanning the land like they owned it. Abigail's hand found the axe handle by the door. Her tired heart started to pound a frantic, forgotten rhythm. They rode right past her cabin. Their eyes were fixed on the small, traditional dwelling down by the creek. Abigail watched from her window, a cold sickness twisting in her gut. She saw them dismount, saw one of them kick at the stretched hide of Winona's home. She saw Winona emerge, her son hiding behind her skirt, her back a straight line of defiance. The men laughed, a sound that soured the air. And right then, something inside Abigail, something buried under 2 years of sorrow, finally broke. It wasn't courage. It was something fiercer. It was a raw, primal refusal to watch the world take one more thing from her. She turned from the window. She went to the chest at the foot of her bed. She lifted the lid. Walter's rifle lay there, oiled and ready. "Just in case, Abby," he had said. "The world isn't always kind." Her hands didn't shake. She didn't think. Thinking would let the fear in. She walked out of her cabin, the rifle held low, the weight of it a strange, solid comfort in a world that had dissolved into chaos. The men turned as she approached. Their laughter choked into sneers. The leader, a man with a scarred face and cold, empty eyes, stepped forward. "Well now," he drawled, his gaze crawling over her. "Look what we have here. A lonely widow come to join the party." "There is no party," Abigail said. Her voice was a stranger's, steady and cold. "This is a private home. You will leave these people in peace." The scarred man, Garrett Vance, let out a chuckle that had no humor in it. "These people? You mean the savages? We're just collecting a tax, ma'am. A tax for them living on land that ain't theirs no more." His eyes glinted. "And now a tax on you for interfering." "They have nothing for you," she insisted, her knuckles bone-white on the rifle stock. "Leave. Now." Vance's smile vanished. "You're in no position to be giving orders." He jerked his head at his men. "Get what you can from the hut. I'll deal with the welcoming committee." 2 men started toward Winona, who stood like a statue, a living shield for her son. Abigail raised the rifle. The motion was clumsy, but the intent was crystal clear. "I said stop." Vance moved like a snake. He crossed the distance in a blur, his hand lashing out, slapping the rifle barrel away. The shock of it jolted up her arms. Before she could even gasp, he was on her. His other hand held a long, wicked-looking knife. He grabbed the front of her dress, yanking her so close she could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "Brave woman," he hissed, his face inches from hers, stupid but brave. Then came the pain. The first stab was a hot, blinding shock just below her ribs. Air tore from her lungs. He didn't stop. The knife was a cold, vicious rhythm. Again and again. She felt a tearing in her side, a sharp fire in her shoulder. Through a haze of agony, she saw Winona's horrified face, heard Chaitan's small cry. She tried to fight, but her strength was pouring out of her, a warm tide spreading across her stomach. The world tilted, the sunset blurring into a dark, swirling storm. She counted the pain as a distant fact. 7 distinct, searing violations. Her last thought was of failure. She crumpled to the ground, the coppery scent of her own blood filling her senses before the darkness swallowed her whole. She came back to the world slowly, like a swimmer rising from a deep, dark ocean. The first thing she noticed wasn't pain. It was a smell. Wood smoke and something else, something sharp and herbal, like the prairie after a storm. This wasn't her bed. The surface was soft furs over a willow frame. The ceiling wasn't wood planks, but stretched hides, filtering the light into a warm, amber glow. She tried to move. A chorus of fire screamed along her side, her shoulder, her belly. A moan escaped her lips. A gentle hand, cool and soothing, immediately touched her forehead. She forced her eyes open. Winona was leaning over her, her expression a mask of deep, wrenching concern. "Be still," Winona said. Her English was soft, hesitant, but clear. It was the most Abigail had ever heard her speak. "You have been hurt badly." The memory hit her like a physical blow. Vance's face, the glint of steel, the searing pain. "The men," she whispered, her throat raw. "Gone," Winona said, her voice tight. "They took little, fled, spooked by what they did to you." Abigail looked down. Her dress was gone, cut away. Her torso was wrapped tightly in clean linen, stained with dried blood and a greenish poultice that gave off that sharp, clean scent. Every breath was a mountain to climb. Her body felt like a shattered jar, barely holding itself together. For days, she was lost in a fever dream. Her world shrank to the taste of broth Winona spooned into her mouth, the coolness of a wet cloth on her brow, and the quiet, watchful presence of Chaitan. The boy sat in a corner, a silent sentinel, his dark eyes never leaving her. Sometimes he would slip out and return with fresh water or herbs, his movements silent and purposeful. In her lucid moments, a crushing vulnerability washed over her. She, who had prided herself on being strong, on needing no one, was now completely helpless, utterly dependent on the very people she had failed to protect. Winona cleaned her wounds with a terrifyingly methodical tenderness. Abigail saw the deep, angry punctures in her own skin and was swamped with a wave of shame. She had been broken open, laid bare. But in Winona's care, there was no judgment, only a focused, life-giving duty. One morning, the fever finally broke. She woke up weak, hollowed out, but her mind was blessedly clear. The pain was a dull, constant ache instead of a raging fire. She noticed Chaitan wasn't in his usual corner. "Where is the boy?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. Winona paused from grinding herbs with a stone pestle. She looked at Abigail, her gaze unreadable. "He has gone to bring word." "Word?" Abigail was confused. "To whom?" "To our people," Winona replied simply, and turned back to her work. Abigail didn't understand, but she was too exhausted to ask more. She closed her eyes, drifting into a real, healing sleep. She didn't know that Chaitan, a boy of 10, had ridden for 2 days straight, pushing his small body to the absolute limit. He wasn't carrying a message of war or loss. He was carrying a message of a debt of blood, given by a woman who was not his kin. A week later, Abigail was strong enough to sit up. She was sipping a bitter tea when she heard it. It started as a low tremor in the earth, a vibration felt in the bones more than in the ears. It grew steadily, becoming a sound like distant thunder on a cloudless day. Winona rose to her feet, her face impossible to read, and went to the flap of the lodge. Abigail's heart started to hammer against her ribs, a new kind of fear wrestling with curiosity. The sound grew louder and louder, a deep, rhythmic drumming. It was the unmistakable beat of hundreds of hooves on hard-packed earth. And then they came. They crested the ridge to the east, a flowing river of men and horses, their silhouettes stark against the morning sky. It wasn't a war party, it was an army. Dozens of them, then more, until the entire horizon was filled. They were a silent, powerful force, their faces painted not for war, but with symbols of grave purpose. At their head rode a man of immense stature, his face stern and deeply lined, a single eagle feather in his long black hair. And at his side, looking impossibly small, rode Chaitan. They stopped 100 yards from the lodge. The air thrummed with their presence. Abigail felt a cold spike of fear, the ingrained terror from stories of savage warriors. But then she looked at Winona, who stood calm and straight, and she saw Chaitan point. He was pointing toward the lodge. He was pointing at her. The leader dismounted, his movements fluid and powerful. He handed his reins to another warrior and walked toward them. He stopped before Winona, inclined his head, and then his dark, piercing eyes fell on Abigail. They seemed to take in everything at once, her pale face, the bandages, the pain that still lived in her expression. "I am Tushunka," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "The boy, Chaitan, brought word to our council. He told us what you did. He told us of the blood you shed for his mother, for him." Abigail could only stare, speechless. She felt tiny and insignificant before this man and the silent army at his back. Tushunka took another step closer. "Our law is old. A debt of blood is the highest debt. You stood as family to defend one of our own. You took wounds meant for them. An act of such honor cannot be met with simple thanks." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her small, broken form. "The council has decreed. The life you saved now belongs to you. The life you risked will be protected. My men and I, we have come to be your guard." Abigail stared, the words echoing in the sudden silence. Her guard? The idea was so immense, so preposterous, it broke her brain. I don't understand. I am just one woman. I only did what anyone should have done." "Few would have," Tushunka said, his voice softening just a fraction. "You stood alone against 5 men, for a woman and child not of your people. In our world, that is the act of a chief, of a warrior. We will honor it as such." He looked back at the sea of silent witnesses on their horses. "An enemy to you is now an enemy to the people. This land you live on is now under our protection. You will not be alone again." The days that followed felt like a fever dream. The 100 warriors didn't crowd her. They were a quiet, powerful presence that remade the world around her. They set up their camp by the creek, a small, disciplined village of lodges rising from the prairie grass. Sentries appeared on the ridges, motionless silhouettes against the sunrise and sunset. The hollow silence that had defined her life was gone. It was replaced by a new, living quiet, filled with the soft murmur of a language she didn't understand and the gentle nickering of horses. Her fear vanished, replaced by a profound awe. They were not the wild savages from the settlers' fearful gossip. They were organized, disciplined, and deeply respectful. No one approached her cabin without a clear purpose. One morning, a perfectly cut stack of firewood appeared by her door. The next, a brace of rabbits, cleaned and ready for her pot. She watched from her window as a warrior spent an entire afternoon meticulously repairing a broken section of her fence with just a knife and some sinew. He never once looked toward her, never sought any thanks. The work was simply done. Tushunka visited every day. He would sit with her on the porch as her strength slowly returned. At first, they spoke little. He would ask about her health. She would thank him for his men's help. But gradually, the silences between them grew comfortable, full of a shared gravity. He began to tell her about his people, not in grand speeches, but in small stories. He pointed out the different calls of the prairie birds, explaining what each one meant. He taught her how to read the clouds to predict the weather. In turn, Abigail found herself speaking of Walter, of his love for this land, of his dream for a family that the fever had stolen. She spoke of the loneliness that had been her only companion for 2 long years. Tashunka listened, his dark eyes filled with an attention that made her feel truly seen for the first time in an age. "The pain of loss is a heavy blanket," he said one evening, as the first stars pricked the velvet sky. "It can keep you warm, or it can smother you. You have carried it alone for a long time." She looked at the strong, weathered lines of his face and knew, with absolute certainty, that he understood loss. In that moment, the vast cultural canyon between them seemed to vanish, bridged by the simple, human language of sorrow. Her body healed. The deep punctures became puckered scars, a permanent map of that terrible day etched onto her skin. But as her body mended, so did her spirit. The hollow place inside her began to fill, not with the old grief, but with a new, strange sense of belonging. Her isolated homestead no longer felt like an island. It felt like the heart of a community. She learned the names of some of the warriors. Wapasha, a young man with a quick smile who was a master carver, leaving small, intricate animal figures on her windowsill. Kangi, an older, silent man who seemed to speak with his eyes, and who always made sure her water barrels were full. But this strange new world could not remain a secret. News travels slow on the frontier, but it travels sure. And in the dusty settlement of Providence, 20 miles away, the whispers started. The story twisted with every telling. The widow Hale, attacked, and now held captive by a band of savages, or worse. She'd turned her back on her own kind, a sympathizer, an outcast. Fear and prejudice are powerful fuel, and the fire of suspicion grew quickly. One day, a new group of riders appeared on the horizon. Not outlaws. This was a posse from Providence, led by Sheriff McBride, a man with a hard jaw and harder eyes that saw the world in black and white. Tashunka's sentries had signaled their approach long before they arrived. By the time the posse reined in their horses 100 yards from Abigail's cabin, they found their way blocked. 50 Lakota warriors stood in a silent, unyielding line, bows in hand. At their center stood Tashunka, his arms crossed over his chest. Sheriff McBride's face flushed with anger. "I'm here to see Mistress Hale," he shouted, his voice tight. "We have reason to believe she's being held against her will." Before Tashunka could answer, the cabin door opened. Abigail stepped onto the porch. She was still pale, but she stood tall. The simple dress she wore couldn't hide the new steel in her spine. "I am quite well, Sheriff McBride," she called out, her voice clear and strong. The sheriff stared, his composure cracking. "Abigail, are you safe? Can you speak freely?" "I have never been safer in my life," she replied. Her gaze swept from the sheriff to the line of warriors and back again. Then she did something that sealed her fate. She walked down the porch steps and stood beside Tashunka. It was a clear, unmistakable declaration. The men in the posse shifted in their saddles. "These men," she continued, gesturing to the warriors, "saved my life after I was left for dead by men of my own color. They have shown me nothing but honor. They are not my captors, they are my guests and my guards." McBride's face hardened. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't know what you're doing. Harboring 100 hostiles is a danger to the whole territory. I'm ordering them to disperse." Tashunka finally spoke, his voice low but carrying absolute command. "We are not hostiles. We are here to honor a debt. This woman's safety is our sacred duty. We will not leave her unprotected." "Unprotected from what?" the sheriff scoffed. "From your own kind, I wager." "No," Abigail said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Unprotected from men like Garrett Vance, the ones who stabbed me 7 times and left me to bleed to death. Have you found them, Sheriff? Have you brought them to justice?" McBride was silent. The accusation hung in the air, a stark indictment of his failure. He knew of Vance. He'd never had the guts to go after him. "I suggest you and your men return to Providence, Sheriff," Abigail said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "There is no trouble here, unless you intend to start it." Defeated and humiliated, McBride stared at the woman he no longer recognized, standing beside the imposing Lakota chief, flanked by a silent army. He wheeled his horse around without another word. As they rode away, the dust they kicked up looked like a shameful retreat. But the confrontation had started a new clock ticking. News of the posse's failure would travel, and it would eventually reach the ears of the one man who had a reason to see Abigail Hale silenced for good. Garrett Vance had left her for dead once. Hearing that she'd survived, that she was now protected by an entire tribe, that was a loose end he could not tolerate. It was a challenge to his brutal reputation. The true test wasn't over. It was just beginning. The quiet that followed the sheriff's departure was heavy with tension. Tashunka knew what was coming. His sentries became even more vigilant, their watchfulness a low hum of energy across the prairie. A man like Vance, driven by venomous pride, wouldn't let this go. He wouldn't just come back to finish the job. He would come back to burn down the symbol Abigail had become. The attack came on a moonless night, under a sky so thick with stars it felt suffocating. The first warning wasn't a sound. It was the sudden, dead silence of the night crickets, the restless shifting of the horses. Then a sentry on the western ridge let out the sharp, piercing cry of a nighthawk, a signal answered instantly from the other posts. The camp exploded into life, not with panic, but with a swift, deadly purpose. Abigail was in her cabin, mending a shirt for Chaitan by lamplight, with Winona sitting quietly nearby. At the first cry, Winona was on her feet. She snuffed out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. "They are here," she said simply. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat, but this time the fear was different. It wasn't the paralyzing terror of a victim. It was the cold, sharp fear of someone with a family to protect. She pulled Winona and Chaitan toward the root cellar, the safest place in the cabin. Outside, the night erupted in gunfire. Flashes of light illuminated scenes of brutal close-quarters combat. The outlaws, a dozen strong this time, had tried a surprise assault. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They weren't attacking a sleeping camp. They were charging into a meticulously prepared web of defense. From the cellar grate, Abigail saw flashes of the battle. The Lakota warriors moved like ghosts, fluid and lethal. They didn't fight in a line like soldiers. They flowed like a pack of wolves, striking from the darkness, their war cries a chilling answer to the panicked shouts of the outlaws. The fight was a maelstrom of chaos and precision. She saw Tashunka, a towering giant in the sporadic light, moving through the fray with a heavy war club, his movements a blur of devastating force. The outlaws' attack crumbled. Their surprise turned into a desperate, losing battle for survival. They were encircled, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. The fight surged closer to the cabin. Garrett Vance, in a final crazed gambit, tried to reach Abigail. He broke through the outer ring of fighting, his face a mask of pure fury, a revolver in each hand. He saw the cabin, his prize, his obsession, but his path was blocked. Tashunka stood before him, breathing heavily, his expression one of cold, final judgment. "You have brought death to a place of peace," Tashunka said, his voice a low growl. "She's a witch! Got you savages wrapped around her finger!" Vance screamed, raising his pistols. "I'll send you all to hell with her." He fired. The shots were deafening, but Tashunka was already moving, weaving to the side with impossible speed. The bullets thudded harmlessly into the cabin wall. Before Vance could fire again, Tashunka closed the distance. There was a sickening crunch as the war club connected with Vance's arm, sending one pistol flying into the night. Vance roared in pain and rage, trying to bring his other weapon around, but Tashunka was relentless. The fight was brutally, terribly short. It ended with Vance on the ground, silenced forever. Slowly, the sounds of battle died away, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the low, victorious calls of the Lakota. The threat was over. The sun rose on a scene of quiet finality. The bodies of the outlaws were gone, dealt with according to custom. The tribe was tending to its own. They had suffered losses. 3 warriors had fallen. Their deaths were met not with cries of despair, but with a deep, solemn grief, the beginning of rituals to honor their sacrifice. Abigail emerged from the cabin, her legs unsteady. The prairie was scarred by the violence, but it was peaceful now. She saw Tashunka standing alone on a small rise overlooking the creek. She walked to him, her heart a heavy mix of relief and sorrow. "It is over," he said without turning. "Yes," she whispered. "I am sorry for the lives that were lost, for the men who died for me." Tashunka turned to face her. His face was etched with weariness, but his eyes were clear. "They did not die for you, Abigail Hale. They died for what you represent. They died defending honor. It is a good death." He looked toward his camp. "The threat from Vance is gone. We have paid the debt of blood in full. You are safe now." A new kind of loss, sharp and unexpected, pierced her. Will you be leaving?" He gave her a small, rare smile. 100 warriors are no longer needed to guard one woman. My men have families, duties. Most will return." He saw the shadow cross her face and added, "But this place is now known to us as the home of the honored woman. It is under our watch always. A small party will remain camped nearby, for as long as you wish it." He paused, his voice growing softer. "And a bond has been made that is not so easily broken. Winona and Chaitan will stay with you, if you will have them. You are no longer a woman alone. You are kin." In the weeks that followed, a new life took root. Winona and Abigail became sisters of the heart, their comfortable silence filling the space as they worked together in the now expanded garden. Chaitan became the son Abigail never had. She taught him to read from her few treasured books. He taught her the Lakota names for the stars. Tashunka was a frequent visitor, his presence a quiet, steadying force. The cabin that had been a monument to grief became a home, filled with the murmur of 2 languages, the laughter of a child, and the sharing of meals. One evening, standing on her porch watching the sunset, Abigail touched the scars on her side. They were part of her, no longer just a reminder of pain, but a testament to a strength she never knew she had. They were the price of connection, the mark of a life that had been broken open only to be filled with something richer than she had ever lost. She looked out at the distant, friendly glow of the Lakota campfires under the rising moon. The prairie silence was still there, but it was no longer an emptiness. It was a peace she had earned. It was a home she had found, not in a place, but in the shelter of an unexpected, honorable, and fiercely loyal family. If you were moved by Abigail's journey from a lonely widow to the heart of a new family, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more stories of incredible courage and unexpected connection.